Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nita Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're talking about some more Bloomburrow Limited today, and in particular, we're going to be looking at 10 cards that you should stop playing. You know, that's the title. It's a little more nuanced than that. It's more like these are cards that you shouldn't be picking as high based on what their win rate is, but that doesn't make, as good of a title. And a lot of these are cards you should just stop playing, but not quite all of them are. The point is, I'm using 17 Lands data, which you can find at 17lands.com. You can sign up to have them track your limited data, and we have, tens of thousands of drafts worth of data now, probably more like hundreds of thousands, actually, at this point. And we can use that data to start analyzing the set. One thing to always keep in mind is that data doesn't mean everything. Like, I would never ever advise somebody to go through a draft and just take the card with the highest win rate out of every pack. That's not going to go well for you. That isn't how the data works. You need to be in the deck that's open. You need to be taking cards that are at least in your colors. And in this particular set, I think problems with just looking at win rate are more pronounced than usual because you've got cards like Scales of Shale and Cash Grab that have these really high win rates, but you can't play them in just any deck. You need at least like 5 squirrels before you can play Cash Grab and like 5 lizards before you can play Scales of Shale. But that's something that I think is more pronounced on the end of like looking at cards that have really high win rates than it is on cards with really low win rates. And the reason those cards have those high win rates is because it's glaringly obvious you can't play those cards in the decks that don't have the synergy, because, it's very signposty the way they tell you what deck you can play those cards in. So people aren't playing them in like just any deck. If they were, the win rates would be lower. But yeah, I think those issues with the data are more pronounced when looking at high win rates and looking at low win rates, but there are still some issues with low win rates, some of which I'll address. But I do still think we can take a lot of information, a lot of knowledge from looking at this data and thinking about what it means and what it's telling us. So we'll be looking at 10 cards in this video, using that data, specifically looking at cards that are being taken way too high in the draft for how they're actually performing. So, as usual, I like to have a baseline card. I always sort of pick out a card that's like solid, that you'd play like 2 of in every one of your deck with that color, but you're also not pumped about. And this time around, I'm going with Dagger Fang Duo. 3 mana, 3/2 Death Touch, mills 2 when it enters. It works especially well in the Squirrel deck, but it's also fine in blue-black, and it's kind of okay in any black deck in the format because there's enough random recursion for the mill to matter, and it can, trade with anything. It's taken around pick 7.47, which I think is just about right, and has a win rate of 55.9%. As usual, when we're thinking about win rates in these sets, we can't just take our knowledge of what a win rate usually is in Magic, where if you took everybody who played every game of Magic in a format, the overall win rate would be 50%, because Magic's a zero-sum game. But 17 Lands users are better than your average players because they're, looking at data and want their data tracked, and they're thinking a lot about Limited. They're very invested. And so the average win rate on 17 Lands for this set is 54.7%. So that's not as much better as it might seem if you're just thinking about 50%, but it's a slightly above average card. A card that, like I said, you're going to play a couple of in most of your black decks, especially in blue-black and blue-green, or black-green. And the thing to keep in mind here, I think we can all agree this card's not amazing. It's not bad either. But the thing to keep in mind here is that every single card we're about to look at in this video, all 10 of them, have lower win rates, but they're being taken higher in the draft. Let's start with Clifftop Lookout. So, green is one of the better colors in this set, and Clifftop Lookout only has a 53.5% win rate, and it's being taken around pick 5.21. So, in a lot of formats, I think I may have given this a B- in the set review. I at least gave it a C+. Like, in a lot of formats, in most formats, card that adds to the board, like, it's not a great body, but it's okay. Ramps your mana, can fix it to some degree, has a useful creature type. All of that sounds great, right? Well, the problem is, there's not really a place to play this Lookout. Like, the value it generates for ramping doesn't really matter in this format. This is not a format where you're ramping your mana very much. And it is a format where you need creatures who have like okay bodies that can trade, and or they need to be able to have a good enter the battlefield ability. But in this particular format, you're just not that excited about a land. I mean, one of the awkward things about the Lookout, like, if you played on 3, it's decent. Like, that doesn't feel too bad. But when you get it later in the game and you really don't want another land, it's kind of like just drawing another land because the body is as insignificant as it is. Even though blue-green likes to blink things and likes frogs, this card just doesn't perform well because it's just not the right format for it. If this was a format with a legit ramp archetype or like a couple of real reasons to ramp, like, it would be a good card. But this isn't that format. You just need to be curving out, playing real bodies, turning them sideways. This format just has so many good aggressive creatures, so many good tricks. You just can't be playing a random 3-mana 1/2 with a very minor into the battlefield ability. It's not like entirely unplayable, right? I mean, 53.5% isn't good, but if you're in a green deck that has some 6s and 5s, which you don't want a ton of, but you might have a few of them, and you could really use another frog in your deck, like, it's okay. It just definitely shouldn't be being taken as pick, at pick 5.2, which is where you should be picking up cards that you feel good about having in your deck, and this is one that you feel not great about. So, on a related note to like what all the tricks in this format do to this format, let's look at Agate Assault. So, it's got a win rate of 54%, and it's being taken around pick 6. So, 3-mana, deal 4, usually a pretty good removal spell in Limited. This one not being an instant is something I was concerned about going into the format, and I think kept it from being what I would have considered premium removal even going into the format. But there's just so much going on in this format that makes removal, especially removal that costs like 3 or more, or damage-based removal in particular, pretty bad. The main thing is just that there are way too many tricks in this format that just blank removal. And most decks are playing a bunch of them because they're also crazy efficient, like removal spells effectively, where you can just blow your opponent out if they block. So the big ones that you have that can blank removal for so little mana, you've got Crumb and Get It, which, sure, you give your opponent a food, but you blink their removal spell. So, you come out way ahead, especially if it's also in combat. You've also got Shore Up in this format. It's not as good as Crumb and Get It, but it's pretty good. You've got Overprotect, even though it costs 2, unlike a lot of the other good tricks in the format, which cost 1, it's like crazy good. Like, the effect that it has is just massive because there's trample involved. It can't die to removal. It can't die in combat if you use Overprotect. So that makes, all of these removal spells a lot worse. Scales of Shale, Indestructibility. Sure, your opponent, to really make it good, they need lizards, but you run into that plenty too. So this format just has a bunch of indestructibility, hexproof auras. I mean, even the 1 green mana +1/+3 aura is like okay in this format, or trick that is okay in this format, and it can blank Agate Assault. So first of all, you have all those tricks that make removal worse than it usually is, especially removal that costs more than like 2, and removal that doesn't do anything else. Like, cards like Savor are great because, they're efficient, so it's easier to find a window when your opponent doesn't have mana up to use their tricks, and then it gives you food, which is a huge asset in this format. So, 1 and 2 mana removal, still pretty good, but everything that costs like 3 or more is a lot more questionable, especially when its main effect is just removal, and especially when it's sorcery speed. You're just going to get your removal spell blanked way too often, especially at sorcery speed. And on top of that, as usual, like, we have more and more ETBs. This format has Offspring in it, which makes this removal a lot worse. There's just a bunch of 2-for-1 type creatures or creatures with good ETBs, and playing the Assault isn't great. And even just to add to that, creatures, you end up needing to remove like a 2-drop a lot of the time in this format, and having to do it with Agate Assault just doesn't feel good. So it's not terrible. Red is one of the bad-ish colors in this set. Blue and red are the two that are a little underwhelming compared to the others. So a 54% win rate is a little better than it looks at first because of how red's performing overall. So, like, this is a card that you can play one of and maybe two of and feel kind of okay. But you should not be taking it with pick 6 like ever. It's just not a format where 3 mana deal 4 at sorcery speed is what you need to be doing. On a somewhat related note, let's look now at Kingfisher. So this has a win rate of 54.6%, so it's certainly better than a lot of what we see on this list. But it's being taken around pick 6.8. And it's just so hard these days in this new-ish, I guess it's not new anymore, but the way limited sets, most of them seem to be designed these days, it's very tough having a 5-mana creature that just doesn't do anything on its own. And sure, a 5-mana 4/5 flyer, that stat line sounds really nice, but when you factor in the crumb and get it and overprotects and all of these things, your opponent, you spend 5, you tap out to play this, you're like, okay, I'll play a bird next turn, and then I'll get a fish, and then things will be all right. Maybe I'll stabilize against this aggressive start. Doesn't usually go that way if you tap out for something like this that doesn't have an immediate impact other than being a body, because there's so many tricks that offer big boosts for low mana that will just allow their 3-power creature to punch right through Kingfisher. And yeah, this one definitely isn't bad. This is certainly the best card on this list. It's got good stats. If your opponent doesn't deal with it, or you're not forced to block when your opponent has mana up, which is such a feel-bad thing in this format, isn't it? Where you either cast a removal spell when your opponent has mana up, or you try to block one of the core things you do in Magic when your opponent has mana up, and you just get blown out way too often in this format. It's a horrible feeling. And a card like Kingfisher that, you need bodies, especially the expensive ones, to do something. Like, if this was into the battlefield, make a fish, way better than what it is, because as it stands, it's most of the time just a French vanilla creature that costs too much in a format where your opponent's just curving out and casting combat tricks. All right, so let's look now. This list is, it's entirely commons and uncommons with one exception. I wanted to talk about Helga Skittish Seer, partly because I gave this one a really good grade in the set review, at least a B+, and it might have been an A-. But I think talking about Helga helps us understand something about the format. It's something I've talked about the last few weeks, but I think it bears repeating. And that is that splashing is really, really hard in this format. There's just not good fixing. And playing a third color is just not a great way to go. You're going to decrease your deck's consistency. And I think that's something that Helga shows us, because it's taken around pick 4, which, on paper or cardboard, when you look at Helga Skittish Seer, it looks like a really good card. It's got a bad stat line, which is a liability in this format. Costs 3 different colors of mana, and it doesn't usually do anything the turn you play it. So it's got a lot of the other problems I've already talked about in this video, but add to that the fact that playing these 3 color cards isn't good. It's just better, 90 times out of 100, which I guess I could say 9 times out of 10. It's better 9 times out of 10 to not play a third color. I think you're better off not doing it, not hurting your mana, because you need to be able to consistently curve out in the format. And having a value card, which, if you are allowed to untap and then you play a 4-mana thing, you get that trigger once, you feel great, and things can really snowball from there, but it just doesn't happen between its bad stats, and by the time you cast it in the game, you're kind of in top deck mode and hoping you'll draw the right thing, and that's never a good feeling. The main reason being it's just hard to get 3 colors of mana when you need it in this format. All right, let's look next at Mouse Trapper. Of all of these, this one surprises me the most that it's being taken so highly. So it's got a 51.5% win rate, and it's being taken around pick 6.2. So that's a really, really, really high to be picking this card, especially given its win rate. But it doesn't look that good on paper either, I don't think. A 3-mana 3/2 flash, probably not a card you play. People often say, well, it's kind of like a 3-mana removal spell, and it's like, okay, it's a very highly situational one that is more expensive than it should be for being that situational and for only being able to kill smaller things. When you can flash it in and kill a 1-power creature, that feels great. That doesn't come up much. Most of the time you flash it in and you trade it for like a 3/3. Then it has this trigger, which, I did think in the set review had some potential. We've seen a lot of cards over the years that are like aggressive creatures, your territorial hammer skulls, your Goblin Heel Cutters and the like that are, 3 or 4 mana creatures. When they attack, something can't block, and they tend to really open up combat in a big way, bigger than your opponent expects, bigger than you might expect until you sort of look at the board and realize, wow, that blocker's gone? I can swing with everything. But Mousetrapper's problem is, Valiant isn't as consistent as just being able to attack, even though there's lots of support for it. So your ability to tap things it's there, but it doesn't come up that much. And you're playing a below rate creature that if you can't use that ability like every time it attacks, just isn't worth it. So Mousetrapper's not really where you want to be in white decks in this format. All right, let's talk about Bandit's talent now. This is one I talked about a little last week in my video on 10 cards I got wrong, because even relatively early into the format, I knew I'd gotten this one wrong. We had a bit of data last week. We have a lot more now. I gave this like a B- in the set review because I envisioned playing it early, making your opponent discard, and then leveling it up to these other modes, these other effects, would be enough to make it a card worth playing. Because if you drew it early, you'd make your opponent discard. If you drew it late, it ends up starting to pressure them. But this format is just one where you really need to be getting on board in a real way early. Otherwise, you're in some trouble. And as a result, Bandit's talent has a win rate of 53.6%, but it's being taken around pick 6.8. I do think there are decks where the talent can work, especially if you've got some of the other discard in the format that's like better, better on its own. The 1 black mana instant that makes your opponent discard, and then you can flash it back. That card has performed reasonably well. Only costing 1 early, and then having graveyard value late is like a thing that you're interested in the format. And then there's the Thought Stalker Warlock, the 3 mana 2/2 lizard that makes your opponent discard. Like if you pick up some of that, you can sort of get it into your deck, but it's definitely more of a build around. You can't just put Bandit's talent in any deck, and I think its win rate right now is kind of reflecting the fact that people are, which, going into the format, that's what I was doing, but it turns out you just need to be adding something real to the board on turn 2, and not casting this discard spell, which is like, okay, but you often don't have the time to sink the mana into it late anyway. Black-green is the deck that's the most well-equipped to handle this, because it's the best deck in the format that's like kind of grindy. Like it can grind out wins thanks to all the food and stuff. And so Bandit's talent can work okay there too, but it's a card that people are taking way too highly and playing way too often. You're not playing this in like your black-red deck, for example. You'd rather be curving out with lizards and turning your card sideways and casting Scales of Shale than playing with a fiddly card like this one. All right, let's look now at Parting Gust. So this is an interesting one. It's being taken around pick 5, and it's got a 53.8% win rate. So I wasn't incredibly high on this card because I saw it as I see many of these removal spells that give your opponent something as not really a 1-for-1, because my opponent still has a fish. That fish can attack and block and be sacrificed and all kinds of other things, right? So, sure, I remove their creature, but it's not a 1-for-1. I did think, and I think a lot of players are thinking too, based on the win rate, that this would be, and it is, better than other cards like this we've seen before, of course. It's not like Bovine Intervention. It's not terrible like that. It doesn't make up enough for the fact that you leave your opponent something when you use it as removal, and then also having this mode where you can blink your creature and get a counter on it. Like, I think a lot of us thought those two things would mean that it was okay, that this is a subpar removal spell, but it can deal with a lot of things at least. But it doesn't turn out that that's the case. Also being double white in a format with bad fixing is also worse than normal. You just don't end up, there's not a cycle of dual lands that make it easier for you to cast your double colored spells. In fact, the presence of the villages, which are mostly pretty good, means it's even harder than normal to cast a double white card, because those can only produce colored mana for creature spells. So it's hard to cast, you don't have it available as often as you want it, and it has the same problem we've seen time and time again, where it's not a full-on 1-for-1. You're actually behind most of the time when you cast it, and for that reason, it's kind of like a C- level removal spell that you'll play, but it doesn't make the cut a decent chunk of the time too. All right, let's look now at Sinister Monolith. So I like this card okay going into the set, and I think Mini did, and Mini still are, based on when it's being picked. Has a win rate of 51.4%, taken around pick 7. In the past, we've seen cards that have a life drain trigger that happens every turn work out pretty well. They can be good because that trigger, first of all, creates a gap of 2 life between you and your opponent. It can really change a race just within a couple of turns. And I like this one, and again, other people like it too, obviously, because first of all, you could get it going the turn you play it, and you could also cash it in for cards when you really needed to. On top of that, Black-White's a life gain deck. You have all of these things going on in the format that made it seem like Sinister Monolith was going to be a solid card, at least for that kind of deck. But it really isn't. It has the same problem a lot of these cards do. It doesn't add to the board. Sure, Black-Green likes to do sort of grindy things, but like the grindy things it does is like play cards that add to the board that can then forage for value or give you food. Like you're getting stuff up front, usually attached to a creature, something like that. Whereas Sinister Monolith isn't those things. It's just sort of a card that, yeah, if the game goes long enough and it's left unchecked, it can really alter the game. But games don't often go that long. And even though there is a grindy, life-gainy graveyard deck in this format in Black-Green, that deck doesn't even really want the Monolith because, it can gain all the life it needs to win the game with all of its food. And it would rather be playing cards that add to the board than something that doesn't at all. So, this is a format where this kind of card is a liability. And that's how most limited formats have been lately. We've had a couple sets where it was more possible lately to do this kind of thing, but not this one. We're sort of back to the status quo that we got used to before. Now let's look at 3-Tree Root Weaver. So this is one that I may have said earlier that Kingfisher had the highest win rate. This one actually has the highest win rate. And this is one that you actively can play, but people are taking it way too high. It's got a 55.2% win rate. It's taken around pick 6. So why isn't this as good as usual? Well, it's kind of like what I was talking about with Clifftop Lookout. Like most of the time, 2 mana, 1/3 taps for mana of any color. Sign me up for that. That's a card I do take around pick 6, and that I feel pretty good about having a couple of in my deck. But you've got a few things going on here. For one, not only is there not that good at fixing in the set, there aren't really that many payoffs for fixing. You've got those 3-color legends, but they're at higher rarities. You're not going to be getting them ever. You're generally not splashing other decks' signpost uncommons because so many cards in this set are so build-aroundy that you just sort of stick in your color pair and don't need to reach outside of it. Otherwise, you're harming your synergy. So, and then, of course, like I said with the Lookout, this isn't really a format where you're ramping. Like, no matter what deck you're in, you're not really ramping in this format at all. So it's worse than usual. It's still, playing a couple of these in your green deck isn't bad, especially if you've got a little bit of a higher curve, and especially if you do end up in a spot where you want to splash something. But, the 2 mana 1/3 body is also pretty miserable in a set with lots of 2 mana 3/2s and lots of combat tricks that make it easy for a creature to just punch right through it and then probably get some other kind of value. So it's worse than usual. Like, this kind of card usually is, what people are taking it as, and it has a higher win rate than this, usually somewhere in the 56s or something. But it doesn't, and we should be taking this card later, even if it is okay to play it. And then the last card I want to talk about is Coruscation Mage. So this is being taken pick 5.88, win rate of 53.3%. I like this one in the set review, and early in the format I had some success with it, and you can have success with it sometimes. But the big problem here, and I kind of needed to have a stand-in for this just to drive this point home yet another week in a row. Blue-red is bad in this format, and that's what this card's supposed to be the, one of these exemplars for. One of these cards that, it should be really good in the right deck. It should be like the Scales of Shale of blue-red, but it's not. It's not performing well even in that deck. It's got a 53.3% win rate, which, given what red's win rate is better than it sounds, but it's still not a card you should be taking remotely early. It does feel good when you can cast it with Offspring, and then you start casting a spell or two a turn, and things go wild, especially if you have the 1/3 pinger around, but that card's also pretty bad. And then, the relatively subpar stat line in a set with a lot of 2 mana 3/2s and 2/3s. Like, all of that just sort of means Coruscation Mage isn't doing what it's supposed to. The deck it's supposed to be a part of isn't very good, and it doesn't really do what you need. You know, at least you can play it on 2. That's probably why its win rate isn't a disaster, because you can at least run it out there and try and trade it off early. But that's not a very good ceiling to have on a card that you're taking around pick 6. All right, so those are 10 cards that you should be taking much later, and in many cases, probably shouldn't be playing at all in this limited format, despite the fact that they looked okay going into the set. Next week, we'll look at the flip side, as we usually do the week after we do this video, where we're going to look at undervalued cards, and that's one where it's going to be a little trickier to talk about win rates and where you should be picking a card, because all these really build-around-y cards probably shouldn't be taken insanely high since they're only good in one deck. But we'll talk about that more next week. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.